think we're ready? No, I could do it. Is that okay? Good. Good afternoon. I realize that the horses might already be out of the stable, but we wanted to begin the meal with a prayer, if that would be okay with you. So if we could just be silent. My name is Bernard Hebda. I'm the Archbishop of St. Paul in Minneapolis. I'm really delighted to be here today, and I'm so impressed by this initiative. As both a person of faith and a lawyer, I'm excited to see that the law school is going forward with this as a priority and as an initiative. But let's begin this meal with a prayer. Good and gracious God, we gather this day as women and men of many faiths and creeds to give you praise as the author of all life and all liberty, and to inaugurate the Religious Liberty Initiative of the Notre Dame Law School. We ask you to bless this new venture, so fitting for a Catholic law school, and to bless our time together in these days, so that we might grow in understanding, be renewed in our resolve to defend the rights of our brothers and sisters around the globe and around the block, to praise you freely, to live out our faith in all its dimensions, and to serve you in the ways that you call us to serve. As we gather this day, we are mindful in particular of those who are persecuted for their beliefs. May they feel our prayers of solidarity and fraternal concern. May the meal that we are about to share from thy bounty strengthen us to boldly defend the right to worship freely and openly, the right to religious belief and expression, the right to put our faith into action. Bless us and bless the food that will be placed before us. May our breaking of bread this day be a foretaste of the heavenly banquet, of the promised feast that awaits us in your presence, in that kingdom where every tear will be wiped away, and where you live and reign forever and ever. Amen.
Friends, if I could have your attention, I'm going to introduce our wonderful keynote speaker. My name is Professor Carter Sneed. I have the great privilege of being a professor of law here at the University of Notre Dame. And I want to, first of all, begin by thanking and expressing all of our profound gratitude to the Religious Freedom Initiative here at the University of Notre Dame, which is the vision and the special contribution and really gift of our amazing Dean Marcus Cole. But of course, moving from vision to operation requires a special kind of dynamic energy, and that is entirely attributable to Stephanie Barclay, who is not in the room with us because she's probably actively working as we speak. But if we give a good round of applause to Stephanie Barclay, my colleague, who is the director of the Religious Freedom Initiative. It's an honor and a privilege to introduce today's keynote speaker, a man who has been a true leader in the Catholic Church on the vital issue of religious freedom, as well as a great friend to the Blessed Mother's University. Cardinal Dolan, of course, is an honorary degree recipient. He was our commencement speaker. He's come to our campus many years, and we've traveled to him in New York. We consider him coming to Notre Dame homecoming. So Cardinal, when you come home, we like to welcome you home to your home here at the University of Notre Dame. We're so grateful to have him here with us today. His Eminence Timothy Cardinal Dolan is the Cardinal Archbishop of the Archdiocese of New York, the second largest Catholic diocese in the nation, where he has served since his installation in 2009. Ordained a priest in 1976, Cardinal Dolan holds a license in sacred theology from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas and a doctorate in American church history from the Catholic University of America. Cardinal Dolan served as rector of the Pontifical North American College in Rome from 1994 to 2001, where he guided the seminary formation of a great number of American priests of the new millennium, including faculty members here at the University of Notre Dame. In 2002, he was installed as Archbishop of Milwaukee, where he served for 7 years before coming to New York. He's also served as chairman of Catholic Relief Services and as president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, where he now ably serves as the chairman of the important Committee on Religious Liberty. Cardinal Dolan is the author of True Freedom on Protecting Human Dignity and Religious Liberty, and most recently, I Am With You, Lessons of Hope and Courage in Times of Crisis. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Cardinal Timothy Dolan.
Well done. I hope all is good. Thank you. Thanks, folks. Professor Sneed, thank you. Please, far be it from me to ever keep anybody from eating, so go ahead and eat, all right? Dean Cole and Professor Barclay, my brother bishops, with whom I'm so honored to be. Bishop Rhodes, our local bishop, and Archbishop Hebda, Bishop Zayden, brother priests and distinguished ecumenical and interreligious participants, faculty, students, and guests here at Our Lady's University. I sure appreciate your gracious invitation, your warm welcome and kind introduction. It is rather I who am grateful to be here among you, such a distinguished group. I feel in a way I'm at a family reunion or among friends because I recognize and appreciate so many of you from our work in defense and advocacy of religious freedom. That this lecture is also co-sponsored by the De Nicola Center adds to my happiness. What was it, Carter, about 2 years ago that we had the dedication? And since then, I've tracked with high interest your publications, your events, your conferences, growing all the time in my appreciation to Tony and Christy De Nicola for their benefaction. You also realize, I trust, that this conference here at Notre Dame occurs during the Week of Religious Freedom, as proposed by the bishops of the United States for the past decade. It's scheduled each year to begin with the feast day of two martyrs to the rights of conscience, St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher, and conclude on the 4th of July. To know that we're here during the Religious Freedom Week is especially satisfying. It's appropriate to note that we assemble on the feast of St. Irenaeus in our Catholic calendar, a martyr whose insight rings through the centuries. Remember his insight? The glory of God is man fully alive. And we, as we continue this day, would add that man is fully alive when he or she has the liberty to acknowledge the very glory of God. Remembering these martyrs, and Peter and Paul, whom we'll celebrate tomorrow, helps us recall the words of Pope Benedict. The martyrs died for their faith, and for this very reason they also died for freedom of conscience and the freedom to profess and practice one's own faith, a profession that no state can ever impose. Now look, my words, they've given me about a half hour, my words this afternoon will not be overly cerebral, or lengthy. Many of you could give a much more scholarly talk than I ever could attempt. These words come from a pastor, a citizen who believes deeply in religious freedom, not just as a nice idea, but as essential to the dignity of the human person and the flourishing of all that is noble in us. And I've entitled this presentation, Correcting the Narrative. Correcting the Narrative. Why? Because I'm afraid that what used to be a rather non-controversial no-brainer, defending religious freedom, something as American as mom, apple pie, the flag, and Newt Rockney, has now become caricatured, I'm afraid, as an oppressive, partisan, right-wing, unenlightened crusade. This novel, unfortunate caricature was evident recently to Dan Balstrek. I'm glad he's here. He's our director of our Committee on Religious Freedom. On a conference call sponsored by the administration, was stunned by a participant's observation. The participant did not represent the administration, but nonetheless felt free to add, religious liberty is but a buzzword for discrimination. Now here I stupidly thought that opposition to religious liberty was discrimination, as our foreparents would propose. Remember what James Madison insisted? For anyone can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the supreme governor of the universe. So help me try to correct this narrative, and I got 4 points, all right? Number one, you and I advocate for religious freedom, not primarily because we're believers, but because we're Americans. 2, the defense of religious liberty is hardly some ultra-conservative issue, but one historically considered part of the movement that is usually called progressive and reforming in our history. Number 3, the reason we cherish freedom of religion is not to protect government from religion, but free exercise from the government butting in. And finally, I fear that our culture may have moved from its former postures of encouraging a place in the public square for believers, then to neutrality about the role of faith in the public square, to now an outright antagonism to any voice inspired by faith having a welcomed place in the national discourse. All right? Let me take each one separately. Here's number 1. Religious liberty is not primarily a creedal or an ecclesial matter. It's one of human rights and the American experiment in ordered liberty. Now, to be sure, religion certainly benefits from this first of the 4 guaranteed rights listed first in the Bill of Rights, and our critics may thus be accurate in charging that our muscular defense of it can be self-serving for us believers, but we're defenders of this first right precisely as patriots, as Americans, as rational human beings. Matter of fact, my own faith was a Johnny-come-lately to the cause of religious liberty. Because historically, the church, at least since the time of Constantine, has been convinced that the union of crown and cross was probably the best form of governance. Only 144 years ago did James Cardinal Gibbons, the Archbishop of our premier see of Baltimore, raise eyebrows and snickers and criticism in Rome. He was there to take possession of his titular church as a cardinal, and he stunned the staid congregation with words rather matter of fact for us as Americans. Listen to what he said. For myself as a citizen of the United States, without closing my eyes to our defects as a nation, I proclaim with a deep sense of pride and gratitude, and in this great capital of Christendom, that I belong to a country where the government holds over us the aegis of protection without ever interfering in the legitimate exercise of our sublime mission as ministers of the gospel. Now, I bring that episode up just to illustrate that Catholics, at least in the United States, were hardly early and avid promoters of religious liberty. Sure, they were grateful for it, but for them it wasn't anything creedal. It was simply a radiant jewel in the crown of the multiple freedoms assured in their new country. And my hunch is that such was true with the other faiths so ably represented here this afternoon. Religious freedom was a fact of the American experiment in ardent democracy, which people of all faiths celebrated, relished, and deeply appreciated, and people of no faith at all, and if necessary, would rise to defend, but as loyal Americans, not just as believers. So my first point, is that our history demonstrates that religious liberty was hardly a self-serving creedal interest. It was an insistence of our founders and framers who, while most were hardly pillars of their churches, were certainly convinced of the human rights tradition of the Enlightenment, insistent that the lack of toleration for all faiths that had set Europe ablaze was not about to make the Atlantic crossing, and who bristled at the privileges given the Church of England. So I vigorously defend our first and most cherished liberty, not because I'm a believer, but because I'm a citizen. I defend it not to boost the church, but to boost the human rights tradition at the heart of our republic. No wonder George Washington doubted if democracy could even survive without the vibrant free exercise of religion and a muscular vigilance guarding religion from outside intrusion. No wonder Alexis de Tocqueville, still considered, right, probably the most perceptive commentator in American democracy, would conclude that this fragile democratic republic would indeed survive and flourish. Why? Because of the religious freedom given its churches. And here's point two. Point two in my attempt to correct the narrative. The defense of religious liberty is not a nasty, unenlightened, nationalistic right-wing movement to halt the progressive engine. I'm afraid that the promotion and protection of religious liberty is becoming caricatured in some circles as a narrow, hyper-defensive, far-right, self-serving cause. Not so in our history. Freedom of religion has been the driving force of almost every enlightening, unshackling, noble cause in American history. So thus, the defense of religious freedom is not some white evangelical Christian polemic or a wily strategy of discredited religious leaders. It's the quintessential American cause, the first line in the defense of and protection of all human rights. Religious freedom has always been understood in this land as one of a cluster of fundamental freedoms, right? What do I mean by that? Spheres of free thought and action essential to liberty. The normative idea of a constitutionally, democratically restrained government, a government that makes no theological judgments, that's religious freedom, that does not handcuff the media, that's freedom of press, that does not dictate thought or culture, that's free speech, and that does not dominate all the room of a humane society, that's freedom of assembly, is predicated on the belief in human equality and dignity. In fact, case can be made that the founders were characteristically wise in placing freedom of religion as the first in that famous quartet, since the others would sure be in jeopardy if that leadoff liberty were ever to be diluted. Reminds me of Pope Benedict. Remember before the United Nations? Refusal to recognize the contribution of society rooted in the religious dimension and in the quest for the absolute would effectively privilege an individualistic approach and would fragment the unity of the person and the community. And the philosopher Francis Beckwith agrees, the very question of what is essential to a civil society would be itself in dispute without religious freedom. It was Thomas Jefferson that asked, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift from God. Now, what do you say I roll out some exhibits to make my case that religious freedom in American history has hardly been a cause of chilling, repressive, retrograde movements, but the most liberating, ennobling ones, a point well made by Dan McCanin in his recent prophetic encounters, religion and the American radical tradition. Let's start with the American Revolution itself. You're probably aware of the conjectures of the towering American historians such as Sidney Alstrom and Winthrop Hudson, that the Great Awakening in the middle decades of the 18th century, that was a religious evangelical movement usually associated with the preacher Jonathan Edwards, was one of the major causes of the revolution and our independence, which we'll celebrate this Sunday. The freedom of religion, protecting a spot in the public square for the voices of those speaking from a faith-formed conscience, was a blessing to our republic, and is evident in Exhibit B, the essential role of religion in the abolition of slavery. Now, look, while it's soberly undeniable that every denomination in America, save the Quakers, should shout a big mea culpa when it comes to our failure to take a prophetic stance against slavery. But it's equally undeniable in our history that the leaders of the people who did were mostly inspired by religious conviction. The litany of abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison, Benjamin Lundy, John Greenleaf Whittier, William Collier, Theodore Dwight Weld, even the less fire-breathing ones like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Lyman Beecher, and William Ellery Channing, are a diverse collection, to be sure, but they got one thing in common. Their devotion to the cause of an end to slavery flowed from a conscience formed by faith. Jacob Needleman, the author of American Soul, is thus right in contending that the abolition of slavery was at its core a religious crusade. If a land where loyalty to conscience and freedom of religion were not guaranteed, emancipation would have come at a much more tragically later date. By the way, Dan McCanin, whom I referred to earlier, conjectures as well that because women often had leading roles in the abolitionist movement, the slow but steady advancement of women's equality was also a religiously animated reform movement. Let's then couple the advancement of women with the cause's most colorful project, namely temperance, as Exhibit C in my case that religious freedom is the battery in many of our noble causes. Now, we Catholics might quibble with designating the temperance movement as a religious cause, and to be sure, one would not find many Catholic names on the rolls, okay? But the fact remains that the women of the temperance movement saw their cause as biblical, inspired by conscience, a conscience protected by religious liberty. How about the crusade that is actually called the Reform Movement, led in the latter years of the 19th century by the great commoner himself, William Jennings Bryan, as Exhibit D in my case. Michael Kagan entitles his masterful biography of Bryant, A Godly Hero, and demonstrates that William Jennings Bryan viewed the prairie reform of his age as nothing less than another great awakening. The introduction to Kagan's book, by the way, is even called The Romance of Jefferson and Jesus. According to a review of Godly Hero, Teddy Roosevelt's Fair Deal, Woodrow Wilson's Progressivism, and FDR's New Deal are all direct descendants of this religious crusade called the Reform Movement. Exhibit E would be the Civil Rights Movement. Without the unfettered preaching of the gospel, without the leadership of black Southern preachers led heroically by the Reverend Martin Luther King, whose brilliant letters from a Birmingham jail are perhaps one of the most cogent proof texts for religious freedom, the primacy of conscience and the proper inclusion of religion in the national conversation, and the normative role of natural law in our nation's founding, the civil rights movement would never have flourished. Exhibit F would be the peace movement of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And Exhibit G, a civil rights movement today, the pro-life movement, religiously inspired. Now, I haven't even listed the labor movement, urban reform, or other noble causes, not because they're of lesser importance, but because I'm already in the 7th inning stretch. So here's point 3 to correct the narrative. You following? Religious freedom is enshrined not to protect the government from religion, but religion from the government. See, the Baptists in Rhode Island, the Quakers in Pennsylvania, the Congregationalists in Massachusetts, and the tiny Catholic minority in Maryland during the colonial years, they didn't want any favors from the government. These groups just wanted basically to be left alone to exercise their faith, to worship as they had been raised, and to follow their properly formed consciences in the public square. Ask Lord Baltimore, ask Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, whose assembly would declare freedom of conscience to be protected from government enforcements was the principal ground of our charter, which freedom we still prize as the greatest happiness that we can possess in this world. They didn't want privileges from the state. They just wanted to be left alone. And that desire spread and prevailed and became constitutionally enshrined in the historical provision that Congress shall make no law to establish religion in our first and most cherished freedom. For our foundational generations, this was freedom for religion, to let it flourish unfettered by any government intrusion, not freedom from religion, as today's established creed, secularism, would have us believe. As Charles Chaput, the former Archbishop of Philadelphia, remarks, religious freedom is never just freedom from repression, but also freedom for active discipleship. It includes the right of religious believers, leaders, and communities to engage society and to work actively in the public square. Simply put, government has no business interfering in the internal life of the soul, conscience, or church. Leave religion alone. I once was sitting next to Joe Califano, a close advisor of LBJ, at a meal, and he told me a story about President Lyndon Johnson, that as the first Medicare bill was being formulated in the mid-60s, some of his advisors and drafters suggested including coverage for things that some religions would consider contrary to conscience. Stay away from that, thundered LBJ, probably using more colorful words. Religion is like a beehive. You look at it and protect it from a respectable distance, it'll give you great honey. You stick your hand into it and you'll get stung bad, all right? He knew freedom of religious, leave us alone. And finally, my last concern, throughout most of our history, American culture has welcomed a religious voice in the public square. More recently, normative voices in our society, I include, present company accepted, the academy, entertainment, politics, and the media, insisted upon neutral, neither pro or con faith in the sphere. We can live with either, by the way. But now we witness a downright antagonism to religion among the four estates mentioned above. When Richard Dawkins can compare faith to smallpox, but worse, he said, because it's harder to eradicate, we're in trouble. When the governor of a large state, with which I'm very familiar, can proclaim at a press conference that God, prayer, and faith had absolutely nothing to do with our recovery from COVID and receive a standing ovation. You know our ratings have sunk, folks. The fault line, this fault line separating religious Americans from secularists has been recently documented in a new book. Perhaps you're familiar with it, Secular Surge, that validates this hunch. This anti-religion, this book would claim, comes from secularists who will tolerate religion as long as it's just considered some eccentric private hobby for superstitious, unenlightened folks, limited to an hour on the Sabbath with no claim to any voice in the public square. Oh, such, of course, is hardly free exercise. It was Michelle Obama who pointed out our faith just isn't about showing up on Sunday. It's about what we do Monday through Friday. Or as the Jewish scholar David Novak comments, since I am a religious member of a democratic society, I can make only a religious case for human rights and good faith. Secularists should make their own arguments by themselves, and I'm always ready, prepared to listen to them carefully, since I want to live in peace with them. Nevertheless, secularists should be able to do so without denying me the right to connect my religious belief to my political advocacy, just as I should be able to do so without denying them the right to connect their non-belief to political advocacy. And from this antagonism to religion that we see today, I fear comes the direct intrusion of the government into the very definition of a church's ministry's message and meaning. Republicans and Democrats alike have long agreed that the First Amendment's guarantee of religious liberty includes not only what goes on within the four walls of a church, but also the religiously motivated acts of service that fulfill the mission of that church. Now, I'm afraid, we often hear that we must leave our conscience behind when we step into the public square. Folks, thanks for paying attention. Maybe you'll agree that the four mischaracterizations of religious liberty, there may be more, that I've just tried my best to outline, are in fact accurate, and that correcting them provides us with a lot of homework. Dean Cole, what a gift this law school has been, and what a boost it is to have you sponsor this extraordinary event. Father Hesburgh said that the Catholic University is where the church does a lot of its thinking, and we need a lot of good thinking on this sacred issue of religious freedom. Sadly, maybe you saw it, a prominent Catholic political leader in D.C. stated that the church needs to get over this conscience stuff. Well, no, we don't. And no, we can't, not only as believers, as Americans. All we want to do, along with Cecil Calvert and Roger Williams and William Penn and John Carroll, is to be left alone. All we want, along with the Parson Patriots, Jonathan Edwards, Brigham Young, the abolitionists, William Jennings Bryan, Cesar Chavez, Dorothy Day, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and the Reverend Martin Luther King, is the freedom to carry the convictions of a faith-formed conscience into our public lives. That's the freedom that Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence, who risked his life, his family, his property in the revolutionary cause, that's what led him to sign the Declaration, as he said, to obtain religious as well as civil liberty. Thanks for listening, everybody. All right? You got a present or what? All right.
Thank you, Cardinal Dolan, for those really powerful remarks about religious liberty. We're going to invite the rest of the panelists to come to the stage, and it involves Elder Quentin Cook and Dr. Jackie Rivers. Reverend Meir Soloveichik is going to be joining us on Zoom. We're going to hear first some reflecting remarks by Elder Quentin L. Cook. We'll then hear some remarks by Dr. Rivers and then by Rabbi Dr. Soloveichik. I'll introduce each of our additional panelists and then we'll hear from them in turn. Elder Quentin L. Cook was sustained as a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on October 6, 2007. Called as a general authority in April of 1996, he served in the second quorum, the first quorum, and the presidency of the 70. Prior to his call to be a general authority of the church, he has been a managing partner of a law firm and president and CEO of a California healthcare system. He is a native of Logan, Utah, received a bachelor's degree in political science from Utah State University with honors, and a doctor of jurisprudence from Stanford University. Utah State University awarded him an honorary Doctor of Law degree. He married Mary Gaddy on November 30th, 1962. They are the parents of 3 children and have 11 grandchildren. And Sister Cook is here with us today. It's a pleasure to have her. Dr. Jackie Rivers is currently a lecturer in sociology at Harvard University. She is the Director and Senior Fellow for Social Sciences and Policy of the Senior Institute for the Black Church and Policy Studies. She's also a Senior Fellow at the King's College of New York City. Rivers works with leaders in the ecumenical Black church to promote a philosophical, political, and theological framework for the pro-poor, pro-life, pro-family movement. She has worked on issues of social justice and Christian activism in the Black community for more than 30 years. She serves on the Board of Advisors for the Religious Freedom Institute, the Board of Directors for Becket, the Board of Directors for the Center of Early African Christianity, and, as we're very grateful, on our Board of Advisors for Notre Dame Law School's Religious Liberty Initiative. Rabbi Dr. Soloveichik is Rabbi of Congregation Shearith, Israel, in Manhattan, the oldest Jewish congregation in the United States. He's also the director of the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought at Yeshiva University. After graduating from Yeshiva College, Rabbi Soloveichik attained his rabbinic ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary of Yeshiva University. He holds a PhD from Princeton in religion. Elder Cook, I'll turn the time over to you.
I am grateful for this opportunity to speak at this renowned institution. I thoroughly enjoyed the wonderful remarks that were given by Cardinal Dolan. I feel it especially privileged to be here with Cardinal Dolan and other close friends, Dr. Jacqueline Rivers and also Rabbi Meir Soloveichik. I have been influenced significantly by each one of them. I express my appreciation to Dean Marcus Cole and Professor Stephanie Barclay for extending this invitation to me. I congratulate both of them for the creation of this Religious Liberty Initiative at this leading law school. Those of us who have been deeply involved in religious freedom were saddened last November with the passing of Lord Jonathan Sacks, former Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the British Commonwealth. I appreciated my friend Rabbi Soloveichik's tribute to Lord Sacks in the Wall Street Journal. Much of what Lord Sacks taught resonated in a spiritually powerful way with me and many others. I can remember reading his December 2011 address at the Pontifical Gregorian University. He noted how secular some parts of the world had become. His address was titled, "Has Europe Lost Its Soul?" He stated that one culprit is an aggressive scientific atheism tone deaf to the music of faith. Lord Sacks, a few years later, articulated the concern I have about the diminished role of faith, moral values, and religion in the modern era. He acknowledged the contributions of science, technology, the market, and freedom derived from the democratic institutions, but concluded the result is that the 21st century has left us with a maximum of choice and a minimum of meaning, end quote. I'm deeply concerned that the profound blessings that flow from the religious impulse are often seen as antithetical to what is valued most in our society. Today I will discuss two of those blessings that are lost when we are tone deaf to the music of faith. The first is the way religious accountability benefits secular society. The second is the multitude of good works that religion inspires people of faith to perform on behalf of others. Regarding the first, the role of religion in blessing a secular society was set forth succinctly by Alex de Tocqueville, quoted previously in this meeting. In his 1840 classic, Democracy in America, he stated, "The greatest advantage of religion is to inspire principles. There is no religion which does not place the object of man's desires above and beyond the treasure of earth, and which does not naturally raise his soul to regions far above those of the senses. Nor is there any which does not impose on man some sort of duties to his kind, and thus draws him at times from the contemplation of himself," end quote. Accountability to God for our relationships with each other is a powerful force for good and strongly supports democracy. Being accountable sustains and blesses the values that are most important for societal unity. The late Dr. Clayton Christensen, a renowned Harvard business professor and a dear friend and member of my faith who passed away last year, was known as a valiant supporter of religious freedom. He stated, "Democracy works because most people, most of the time, voluntarily choose to follow the law. Americans followed these rules because they came to believe they weren't just accountable to society, they were accountable to God." Clay raised the question posed to him by a friend, if we lack religion, what institution will we have to teach the next generation to voluntarily follow the laws? The fruit of accountability to God based on religious freedom are self-evident to those who take time to openly mindedly review the matter. The second related fruit that is lost when we are tone deaf to the music of religious liberty is the multitude of good works that people of faith are inspired to perform on behalf of others. There are far too many contributions faith groups make to society to address them all. I could spend the whole afternoon covering the incredible humanitarian efforts emanating from the faiths of those on this panel. I will provide an electronic summary titled Catholic and Latter-day Saint Humanitarian Partnerships at the conclusion of this panel discussion. I will leave it to others to amplify the significance of the commitment to humanitarian projects provided by various religions. One particularly good work I would like to emphasize today is the central role of religions in helping to bless people of all races. I think that Cardinal Dolan covered this in a beautiful way. When you think about the powerful leaders of the abolition and civil rights movements throughout the world, my personal hero is a British, William Wilberforce. Wilberforce was a major part of a group of devoutly religious Christians who considered themselves ambassadors for God. Above all, this group felt an overpowering sense of accountability and a responsibility to God for their actions. William Wilberforce will forever be remembered for being the principal impetus for the abolition of slavery in Great Britain. Indeed, no one accomplished more to abolish slavery. He proposed bill after bill in Parliament and spent his life to put a stop to the most execrable and human traffic that ever disgraced the Christian world. After nearly 50 years of promoting measures that would one day lead to the emancipation of slaves, the goal was accomplished in Great Britain the week before he died, July 29, 1833. Colonial abolitionists, similarly in early American colonies, were the community for whom the practice of religion had been a principal reason for their settlement, were the driving force against the institution of slavery. The Society of Friends, Quakers, particularly in Pennsylvania, stand out in this effort. But many religious groups supported abolitionism or condemned the slave trade or slavery. Martin Luther King Jr., finally, regarding the civil rights movement and his significance in it, when I was a law student at Stanford University, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a hero to my classmates and to me. The civil rights movement he led was animated by the religious convictions. In recent years, I've enjoyed getting to know his son, Martin Luther King III. I was also pleased when I and fellow apostle M. Russell Ballard were invited by Cardinal Francis George to be with a relatively small group to meet Pope Benedict in New York in April of 2008. And I was seated next to Dr. King's daughter, Bernice. I recently read some of Dr. King's sermons before 1960 and before the civil rights finally became civil law. Much of the power of his message was because of the righteous music of faith that was felt. In efforts to continue this important work, I'm encouraged that an alliance for education and humanitarian initiatives between the NAACP and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is based on the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. Upholding constitutional principles. Some argue that upholding constitutional principles like religious freedom is adverse to protecting rights of minority groups in society. That is a false dichotomy. The doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints asserts that divinely inspired principles are contained in the United States Constitution and associated documents. At the Church's last General Conference in April of this year, President Dallin H. Oaks, whose lifelong interest in the Constitution commenced with his experience as law clerk to Chief Justice Earl Warren, gave a seminal address on the U.S. Constitution titled, "Defending Our Divinely Inspired Constitution." His talk included this statement: "Our belief in divine inspirations gives Latter-day Saints a unique responsibility to uphold and defend the United States Constitution and principles of constitutionalism wherever we live. We should trust in the Lord and be positive about this nation's future," end quote. President Oaks acknowledged that inspired principles, when exercised by imperfect mortals, have not always been achieved. A classic example is the beautiful principle that all men are created equal. Abraham Lincoln's assertion on the importance of this aspiration are instructive. The authors of the phrase, "all men are created equal," did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all were then actually enjoying that equality, nor yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon. They meant simply to declare the right so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society which should be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere, end quote. Let me be clear, supporting the U.S. Constitution and advocating for strong, peaceful efforts to overcome racial and social injustice are not opposites. Eliminating racism at all levels needs to be accomplished, and historically, religious conviction has been one of the great forces in accomplishing that goal. So what can be done to prevent society's tone deafness to lose the beautiful music of faith that can bless us all? My plea today is that all religions work together to defend faith and religious freedom in a manner that protects people of diverse faith as well as those of no faith. Catholics, evangelicals, Jews, Muslims, Latter-day Saints, and other faiths must be part of a coalition of faiths that succor, act as a sanctuary, and promulgate religious freedom across the world. We must not only protect our ability to profess our own religion, but also protect the right of each religion to administer its own doctrines and laws. Lord John Acton in 1862 said it this way: "Where ecclesiastical authority is restricted, religious liberty is virtually denied. For religious liberty is not the negative right of being without any particular religion, just as self-government is not anarchy. It is the right of religious communities to the practice of their own duties, the enjoyment of their own constitution, and the protection of the law, which equally secures to all the possession of their own independence, end quote. My own faith and unequivocal support for religious freedom is based on the clear principles established in the doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The Church supports the religious freedom of all faiths as well as those with no faith. Two basic principles which demonstrate the Latter-day Saint commitment to freedom of religion for all are, first, our 11th article of faith, which declares we claim the privilege of worshiping Almighty God according to the dictates of our own conscience and allow all men the same privilege. Let them worship how, where, or what they may. The second is a wonderful statement by the prophet Joseph Smith, who in 1844 publicly called for the abolition of slavery. He passionately asserted his commitment to civil and religious liberty when he said, I am bold to declare before heaven that I'm just as ready to die in defending the rights of a Presbyterian, a Baptist, or a good man of any other denomination for the same principles which would trample upon the rights of the Latter-day Saints, would trample on the rights of the Roman Catholics, or of any other denomination who may be unpopular and too weak to defend themselves. It is love of liberty which inspires my soul, civil and religious liberty in the whole of the human race, end quote. Many in this room have been valiant in protecting the religious-inspired conduct of those who feel accountable to God. You have been engaged in the fighting in the trenches that has been going on in the United States for some time. You've tried to overcome the societal malady represented by being tone deaf to the music of faith. The current status of religion freedom is, of course, one of the principal purposes of this summit. According to the biographer William Hague, William Wilberforce's great fear was that religion and morality would go out of the window. Accordingly, Wilberforce never supported reform that was antithetical to religion. Wilberforce stands out as a beacon of light which the passing of 2 centuries has scarcely dimmed. My challenge to you today is that in our various capacities, we will need to tack against the prevailing winds of disbelief and division. You'll know best how to accomplish this and stand as a beacon of belief and unity in a world that often devalues both. It is my personal prayer that we can collectively elevate appreciation of faith in and accountability to God. It is my hope that both by what we teach and by our example, we can help reestablish the profound significance of the music of faith. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here back at Notre Dame, and I am so honored to be on this panel with Cardinal Dolan, a brilliant speaker, and with our dear friend Elder Cook, who has been really a champion of the efforts of the Seymour Institute, its director, Reverend Eugene Rivers, and myself. And I just point out that I'm the executive director, not the director of the Seymour Institute. I'm so grateful to be here in this opportunity to speak to the issue of religious freedom. And I am honored to be on the panel with Sally, our good friend, Meir Soloveichik. I also want to thank Dean Marcus Cole, for his vision in establishing this religious freedom, religious liberty initiative. And of course, my admiration goes out to Stephanie Barclay, Professor Barclay, for her leadership in all that she has done in actually realizing this vision. So the discussion of religious freedom doesn't often look at the perspectives of the Black church. We are perhaps the stepchild, would you say, Ambassador? Yes. We are the stepchild of the movement. As Justin Giboney so ably argued this morning, the Black church has definitely been on the sidelines. And one might say, why? Why is the Black church, which is so central to the operation of the Black community, why is it on the sidelines on this issue? If the Black church is so important to the Black community, why aren't we standing up for religious freedom? I want to echo some of the themes that have actually already been touched on by both Cardinal Dolan and Elder Cook, and to talk about them, though, from a slightly different perspective. That for the Black church, religious freedom has been both a benefit and a burden. That we have both benefited from it and suffered from religious freedom. And I want to propose an idea which I think captures much of what has been said here, which is we're talking about enacted religious freedom. When people feel free to act on their deeply held religious beliefs, even if they don't choose to make the claims of religious freedom. So, for example, religion was one of the central claims that Southern planters made to defend slavery. And they acted on what they claimed were their religious beliefs. Now, since we all believe that there is one God, and since we believe he speaks to our consciences, one has to wonder whether they actually believed what they claimed. But that was the claim they made, that they were acting on deeply held religious beliefs which were massively disadvantageous to enslaved Black Africans. We suffered a burden because of religious beliefs. Aha. It works. And indeed, you might recognize Senator John Calhoun, who was one of the major promoters of slavery there. But many of the arguments that were being made were made on the grounds of religious belief. In addition to that, the framers, one of the initial framers of the ideas which were later incorporated in the First Amendment, John Locke, in the fundamental constitutions of the Carolinas, actually deliberately wrote the constitutions in such a way as to nullify the impact of prevailing and ancient English common law, which held that you could not enslave a fellow believer. Why did he do this? So that slaves would not be able, upon being converted to Christianity, to make a claim for freedom. Religious freedom has been used by whites as a burden for African Americans in many cases. Of course, I have to acknowledge that it's also been used powerfully by whites as a blessing and a benefit to African Americans. You have heard both Cardinal Dolan and Elder Cook talk about the central role that religion played in the abolition movement. It was really the power behind the abolitionists. It was their sense, their millenarian sense, that God would arrive any day and hold them accountable for doing all that they could to eradicate sin that moved them so powerfully to act against slavery. But let's not forget that there were Black abolitionists, like Sojourner Truth, who was an itinerant preacher advocating for abolition, for women's rights over a period of 30 years. Or a woman like Harriet Tubman, who risked her own freedom going back into the South multiple times to lead people out of slavery, motivated, both of them, powerfully by faith. So this religious freedom, this enacted religious freedom, in which you're not necessarily saying, you're not making a claim in court on religious freedom, but you're simply acting on that deeply held belief, was also a benefit to African Americans. Another example, which has also been mentioned before, the amazing impact of the civil rights movement, motivated by faith. When the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was being named, it was the name originally proposed by Bayard Rustin, who was not a Christian, was the Southern Leadership Conference. Martin Luther King Jr. said, no way, at the center of what we are doing is our Christian faith. This has to be the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And it wasn't just the leaders. I am in awe of Dr. King, despite his many failings, which we will leave unmentioned. But it wasn't just he, it was all of those people who took to the streets. What made Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. so successful was the thousands of Christians who took to the streets. And I don't want to suggest that it was only Christians. There were Jews involved. There were people of every faith. There were people of no faith involved in standing up for what was right. But what motivated those black people who took to the streets was night after night in black churches where there were this outpouring of faith, this praise, this worship, this singing, these inspiring sermons. That gave them the courage to go on the streets, face down policemen with batons, face down police dogs, face down fire hoses. It was their faith that took them to the streets. And so it has been an enormous blessing at the same time. And I want to say that when we stand up and defend religious freedom, we are truly saying religious freedom for all people. As Asma Uddin wrote in her book, we're not trying to be simply that we are defending the right of white evangelicals, their right to their faith at the exclusion of the right of Muslims or Jews or any minority faith. Because we truly believe that for faith to be genuine, it has to be freely given. And if it is freely given, it cannot be coerced. Everyone has to be able to exercise their right to disbelieve completely, if that is what they choose. But that right to act on conscience, regardless of whether you believe in a higher power or not, is fundamental to the movements of freedom that have happened in this country. At the same time, I don't want us to think for a moment that the disadvantages that have flowed from religious faith to black people were limited to the period of slavery. In the middle of the century, during the Civil Rights Movement, some of the most passionate defenders of religious freedom, the Baptists, were almost overwhelmingly opposed to the Civil Rights Movement. So black people continued to suffer as a result of this enacted religious freedom. And why is that so interesting to us today? Why does it matter that the largest denomination that was standing up for religious freedom continued to oppose the rights of black people? What is really important here is that it has created in the black community a kind of opposition. No, that's too strong a word. A reluctance to get involved, a sense of alienation, that religious freedom claims are not necessarily about serving the rights of black people. We are the sleeping giant. I like the kind of irony of this visual because it speaks to the power of the faith, that this is a people who have powerful, active, passionate outpourings of faith, yet on the issue of religious freedom, we are the sleeping giant. Because we have seen many conservative Christians, not only white evangelicals, use their faith as a means to discriminate against black people. We've seen that those who are most invested in religious freedom fail to champion the cause, if not to outright oppose the cause of racial justice. Not just of racial justice, but also to oppose the cause of economic justice. Black churches tend to be small and poor. Many of them are in inner city neighborhoods where levels of violence are very high. They're in inner city neighborhoods where poverty is rife. But the champions of religious freedom have not been there to stand with us as we work for poor mothers, as we work to get education for our children, the champions of religious freedom have been missing in action. And so for that reason, there is a kind of alienation, a hesitation about getting involved. I want to add one other aspect of that, one other dimension. Because these are small churches, because these are poor churches, very often they're overwhelmed. And religious freedom, as Justin Giboney said this morning, is probably not the most pressing threat that we face. The most pressing threat often comes in the form of young black men taking each other's lives, or in the form of the inability to pay the rent or feed the children. For these reasons, the black church has largely been on the sidelines. But there's also a political dimension that I think we have to think about. African Americans overwhelmingly vote Democratic. White evangelicals and many other conservative people of faith tend to vote Republican. There's a long history dating from the Southern strategy of white evangelicals in the South using their political power against the interests of black people. There has not been strong support. In fact, let's talk about the New Deal. Southern Democratic senators stood against, so influenced the shaping of the New Deal that it explicitly excluded the two professions, the two occupations that blacks were most heavily represented in: farm laborers and domestic workers. That meant that many of the benefits of the New Deal did not flow to black people. Furthermore, they ensured that those benefits would be administered locally, which meant that Southern administrators often discriminated against black people even when they were eligible for benefits, they were denied them. So there's a political dimension to this, because black people are overwhelmingly Christian. Something like 85% of all blacks, according to the Pew Research Center, identify as some form of Christian. So when you talk about discriminating against blacks largely, you're talking about discriminating to the most part against black Christians. There is this political dimension that puts us on the sidelines, makes us reluctant to get involved. And that's really a disadvantage to the movement for religious freedom, because there's a level of authority, moral authority, that the black church can bring to this fight that white evangelicals, with their association with discrimination in the South, with segregation, cannot bring. There's a level of moral authority. That's why we are the sleeping giant. If we can overcome some of these barriers and fully engage the black church, we can do so much to advance the cause of religious freedom. We have to have the freedom to live in accordance with our faith. And those who are of no faith at the same time have to have the freedom to live in accordance with their conscience. We have to rouse this sleeping giant. Already, the Seymour Institute has been working on this issue for some years now under the leadership of Reverend Eugene Rivers. Ambassador Susan Johnson Cook has been advocating for this. The AND campaign and Justin Giboney. We are working to engage and to arouse this sleeping giant, and we've made progress. But so much more needs to be done. And so much power lies in achieving this. Thank you.
Rabbi Meir Soloveichik, you're ready to go.
Terrific, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Barclay, and I want to thank you for the invitation and for the honor of serving on this distinguished panel alongside Dr. Rivers, with whom I was also so privileged to serve on Secretary Pompeo's Commission on Inalienable Human Rights, and of course with Elder Cook, with whom I formed a profound fellowship during an epic trip together to the Holy Land several years ago. And of course, I want to thank Cardinal Dolan for his eloquent lecture and for his leadership. I remember once being hosted along with other rabbis and Jewish communal leaders by the Cardinal in his residence in Midtown. And the Cardinal served us a completely kosher meal, which meant not only that all the food was kosher, but that also we could not use what I'm sure was the usual lovely china that would have adorned the table. So everything was served on disposables. And the Cardinal's explanation, which I remember so well, drew on the description of the Jewish people by Pope John Paul II, in which the Pope referred to us as his elder brothers. And what Cardinal Dolan said essentially was that you could tell that having Jews over at the Cardinal's residence was essentially like having family over, because when family comes over, you can serve them food on paper plates. And this amusing but meaningful quip reflected what I think is actually an important phenomenon, as this wonderful event also illustrates, which is how in the face of rising threats to traditional faith and to the religious liberty of us all, at the same time, we, faith communities, have grown closer together. And if we as Jews or elder brothers have something unique to offer this dialogue, it is a principle that lies at the heart of our history and of our own identity. My great uncle, the brilliant Talmudist and philosopher Rabbi Joseph Soloveichik, once stressed that religious Jews throughout history have always sought to embody Abraham's identification of himself in the Bible in Genesis to those amongst whom he lived in Canaan. In Hebrew, he said, Ger v'toshav anochi imachem, which literally translated means, I am a stranger and a neighbor among you. A stranger and also a neighbor, aware of what makes one different while still engaging the world. We as Jews seek to be neighbors. We seek to be fully part of society, the society in which we find ourselves. But we also demand, first and foremost, that we will the right to be as strangers, set apart by our faith, and by our principles. Engaging the world as neighbors while also, like Abraham and Canaan, speaking candidly and eloquently about why we are different. And of course, it is the strangeness of the Jewish demand to do this throughout history that has always, throughout history, marked us and set us apart. One thinks here of the remark made by Edward Gibbon, who in his epic history of the Roman Empire is flabbergasted by the stubborn refusal of the Jews of Judea to go along and get along by embracing the prosperity that was pagan Rome. And he wrote in his history, quote, in contradiction to every known principle of the human mind, that singular people seems to have yielded a stronger and more ready assent to the traditions of their remote ancestors than to the evidence of their senses. We have always sought to be neighbors, but we have also sought to be strangers while we are neighbors, loyal to our faith while part of society. And this aspect of Jewish history was highlighted by a brilliant lawyer and friend of mine who was also a devout Christian, also a friend of many at this conference, who, writing to me once, that he was struck by how many traditionalists feel that they now live in a culture that is not welcoming to them, commented in his email that he was hoping that I or one of my fellow Jews could write an essay providing American Christians with encouragement. And he wrote as follows. He wrote, what I'd love to have happen is for a devout Jew to write an article saying, to my Christian friends, welcome to my world. The idea of the article, he continued, would be to provide, these are his words, would be to provide a little older brother wisdom and point out that government pressure on one's religious practices is entirely to be expected, and that one should not immediately go into mourning when one experiences pressure. Orthodox Jews, he continued, are a great example of remaining true to principle and belief under both the most extreme and most subtle forms of opposition. Christians, he concluded in his email, have to get over the shock of realizing that not everyone is going to be nice to them all the time. End quote. He wrote this several years ago, and I think we all realize this by now. But at the same time, it is the challenge of learning to be stranger and neighbor in society. That challenge has also brought us, faith communities, closer together and allowed us to learn from each other. By a striking coincidence, the phrase strangers and neighbors features in the title of a beautiful small book that was published by Maria Johnson, a Catholic professor at the University of Scranton, who in this book describes her friendship with her Orthodox Jewish neighbors. And she writes in the book about how the common commitment to faith that both she and her neighbors shared was the foundation of their friendship, while also at the same time allowing them to respect their differences. Maria Johnson tells us in the book that it is, quote, a difficult business to live in close proximity with people who are different, always has been and always will be. But, she writes, we have to learn to do it or we may not make it into the next century. At the same time, she adds, we can't afford simply to jettison whatever convictions and commitments might clash with the convictions of others. Because when the going gets tough, and it will, we're going to need our convictions and commitments, end quote. The full name of her book is Strangers and Neighbors, What I Have Learned About Christianity by Living Among Orthodox Jews. And it too illustrates that even as aspects of our own age have indicated that the going might indeed get tough. Nevertheless, in the process, we communities of faith have also found each other. And that, at least, is something to celebrate. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of our panelists for those excellent remarks. We're going to have just a couple questions that we go through, and so if the panelists want to be concise in their answers, that way we'll be able to get through just a little bit more discussion before the close of our lunch meeting. So our first question is, Pew has documented a decline in religiosity in America for most faith traditions. Do you think the decline in religiosity impacts both cultural and legal protections for religious liberty, and how does this affect the vitality of your faith community? Cardinal Dolan, we'll start with you.
You bet. You bet. The book to which I referred earlier, Secular Surge, would hold this. Let's face it, it's a little embarrassing for us in this room to admit it. It's kind of, while it's accurate, it's kind of easy for us to say that the threats to religious liberty come from an aggressive secularism, and that's accurate. But this Secular Surge book, using the Pew Research Center, which all of us hold our breath for as we await the results to come out, says that probably the major threat to religious freedom is that religion is no longer important to a growing number of American people. That's tough for us to admit. We all see it in our own congregations. We all see it in our own flocks. So if religion is marginal, if religion is occasional, if religion is not a driving, passionate, engaging, normative force in your life, odds are you're not going to rise to defend threats against it. So I'm afraid that's accurate.
So I certainly think that that's true. I think it's true because in addition to that, it has a chilling effect. The fact that you know that there are people out there who, because they're not interested in religion, are somewhat hostile to your exercise of your religion, tends to dampen the enthusiasm for religion. I think that that is one effect. I think also, so far, and here I have to give a shout out to Becket Law, there have been excellent results at the Supreme Court in terms of religious freedom cases that have been tried there. But I think I have heard from the lawyers at Becket Law that even the Supreme Court justices are influenced by the trend in the culture. So to what extent does the decline of the importance of religion in the society, perhaps in decades from now, influence the position of justices on these questions, I think is something to ponder. But Russell Moore said something which I think reflects some of what Meir Soloveichik was just saying. And that is, we need to just get over it as people of faith. Jesus said that if we believed in him, we were going to face persecution. We're supposed to stand up despite the fact that it's no longer the politically correct thing to do to be a person of faith. We need to stand for our beliefs, and we need to do it in a way that is loving and compassionate, and that speaks well of those convictions.
Celtic.
I think if you look at a lot of the research on the decline, there still is a very large percentage of people in this country that have strong religious inclinations. I think in terms, if you look at the whole world, still a leader very much in that regard. I think as I was listening to my friend Rabbi Soloveichik and kind of teasing us a little bit about the Jews having discrimination and that there's more now, I couldn't help but think that it's interesting that you have this panel. If you look at the Ku Klux Klan and you go in the 1920s when there were about 5 million, the main targets were blacks, Jews, Catholics. That was the main target of that effort. We were small enough out in the West, I think we would have been a target, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, if we would have been closer. We weren't back there because we had been anti-slavery in the 1830s and had received an order from the government that would essentially we had to leave or else, and so we left and went west. I feel like that it makes you more sensitive a bit when you've experienced discrimination. And there's no discrimination like slavery. There's no discrimination like what has happened to the Jews' history. There's no analog. So in making that, I'm not indicating that there's that. But I think people who have had that in their life are probably more sensitive and wanting to protect everybody and trying to help everybody to have a better life and to be free from discrimination and to have more kindness and more civility. And so I feel like religion is about kindness and civility at its core. And I think that, so as from a religious sense, I think that we have a lot to offer in terms of trying to accomplish that.
Rabbi Soloveichik, anything to add?
Sure, very briefly, and I agree with everything that's been eloquently said. I would just add that we tend to, and I do this myself, we tend to speak about the secularization of society. We all speak about the phenomenon known as the rise of the nuns, by which I mean, of course, not the rise of the nuns, N-U-N-S, which would be a terrific thing for America, but rather the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, meaning those claiming no religious affiliation. And so when we speak about that, we speak about it as if they're becoming secularized and are just without any sort of faith or dogma or doctrine, as if they've just been reading Hume and Rousseau and Voltaire and have embraced a strictly secular rationality in their approach to life. But I don't think that's really the phenomenon that's taking place at all. My actual citation of Gibbon before and my inspiration for thinking about it came from a book which I think is incredibly important and to which I was referred originally by my dear teacher, Professor Rabbi George, which is Professor Stephen Smith's important book, Christians and Pagans in the City. And Smith sees this, as I understand it, is that paganism is back. And we can only understand the tensions in our culture if we realize this. or to put it slightly differently, ancient Rome is not all that ancient. What he means by that is, of course, is that that doesn't mean that people are once again believing in Zeus or Athena or Neptune or Ra or Osiris. But to assume that this is the totality of what paganism is to misunderstand the phenomenon. What it does mean is that the West is once again adopting the pagan orientation in certain circles, the pagan orientation to nature, to creation, to the human being. And therefore, paganism, as in days of old, seeks at times to turn against biblical faith and to wonder why these people of faith can't just embrace everything we've been doing. Can't they see that that's better and more enlightened, just as was said about the Jews in ancient Rome? And I think that's just something that we have to understand as we analyze our society. Professor Smith in his book quotes Gibbon's descriptions of how wonderful pagan Rome was, how prosperous, how extraordinary it was, and how happy the citizens were. And then he adds that, he says, that's all seemingly true, he writes, as long as one intentionally ignored, quote, the vast slave populations, the ubiquitous brothels staffed by desperate and downtrodden women, the lethal savagery of the gladiatorial games, the widespread practice of infanticide, and the dismal tenement housing afflicted by fire and filth and disease. And when we face some of our own issues and debates in our culture, we have to be careful, though I do this myself, by speaking about just the decline of religion. And perhaps we have to analyze this phenomenon and call it more truly by its name.
Thank you. Last closing question, if panelists just want to offer a few statements about this, is are there religious liberty threats on the horizon for your faith community? And in what ways can faith leaders more effectively cooperate to strengthen religious liberty and advocate for each other? Elder Cook, we'll start with you.
Well, I think having this seminar is a wonderful way, and I would like to commend Notre Dame in particular for taking this step. And I think that is the kind of thing that is important, is to have people like this together and to think about it and to talk about it. And I think we just really commend you for doing this. When you think we have religious liberty when it's Stanford, my law school, and we've got one at Harvard now, and to start to think about having law students being involved, not always on the toughest issues. Sometimes they're involved with issues that are very specific, but I think it's wonderful. I can see Jim Sawney here. He's at Stanford and has the Liberty Clinic there, and you get about 90 law students that try and sign up for 17 slots. Am I close, Jim, on that? And so we're seeing that kind of effort. I think that the trying to help, and I think there was a little bit of a plea of more support for black congregations and black colleges. I think that's something that we could certainly try and accomplish. I think that when we do emphasize civility and we strive to have an accountability to God approach where we really do help our neighbors, and we're always trying to think of it that way, and don't try and get entirely in the culture wars and in the political diversity that exists in a way that probably undermines. I thought that Cardinal Dolan's talk was just perfect on that. I thought you traced exactly the direction that we've gone from one area where it was respected, where religious freedom was respected, to one where it's seen as more political. I loved what you said about that. So I think we've had a wonderful event here, and I think it's helping to do it. So thank you, and thanks you, Stephanie, for being the head of this this religious liberty effort here.
Thank you, Elder Cook. Dr. Rivers?
So I think the fact that we are asleep at the wheel is one of the big dangers that the Black church faces. That we are unaware of the threat. Because the Democrats have so often been on board with the issues that are of interest to Black people, protecting voting rights, protecting economic rights, we don't expect a democratic administration to do something that's going to undermine us, and we don't recognize that something like the Equality Act could really put our churches in danger if, for example, the definition of public accommodation is expanded to include churches, and then the Black church, which uses its enacted religious freedom to serve the poor in its communities, could be under threat. I don't think that we are aware of that threat. That's not a unique threat to the Black churches, but I think the Black church is least aware of that threat and has a sense of false safety because there's a democratic administration. And I want to echo what Elder Cook has said, that the more we can talk about this, I think in meetings like this, the better chance we have of collaborating and putting resources, taking on board in a long-term way the issues that are important to the Black church is a way to begin to build trust and a way to begin to arouse that sleeping giant. And I think that that's really critical, very important for us to be working on.
Rabbi Soloveichik, let's go to you next, and then we'll let Cardinal Dolan have the concluding word.
Sure. I'll just briefly say that I don't think that there are challenges in religious liberty that uniquely impact the Orthodox Jewish community. I think what impacts us impacts all traditional communities of faith. It was a wonderful Thanksgiving morning when I woke up to discover that the Supreme Court had ruled last Thanksgiving that prayer together was at least as important as shopping in a liquor store during the rules of the lockdown. And of course, the decision was issued on behalf of two different communities in Brooklyn, the Catholic community in Brooklyn and the Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn. And then when news of the decision came out, and people were angrily tweeting about it, and a New York Times columnist who lived in Brooklyn tweeted about now people would be spreading disease in her neighborhood. She was speaking about both Catholics and Jews, it would seem, and joining us together in her ire, in directing her invective. These issues threaten us all, and therefore it's precisely our togetherness that can provide the best bulwark. And that's why being part of a moment like this, an event like this, is so important, and why, Professor Barclay, I'm so grateful to you.
Thank you. Cardinal Dolan?
Sure. You bet that let me count the ways that there would be threats that I would feel as a Catholic to our own religious liberty. They're as fresh and as revealing as this morning's news service. One of them was highlighted last week with the thanks be to God, the Fulton decision. And what happened, of course, is now look, you all know that the genius of a virtuous democratic society is the ability to defend rights and to balance them, to balance and defend the rights. That's not always an easy task. So when certain rights, and I would question if they are rights, but you know what today is considered rights, the right to abort a baby, or the right to discriminate against an immigrant, or the right to change one's gender, even as a child. When those rights are then forced upon people who find them objectionable in conscience, not only that we would do them, but that we would pay for them, and that we would not teach the peril associated with it, boy, that's something we feel very much. That's something we feel very much, and that would be a threat to our religious freedom.
Thank you to these panelists for these important remarks and for starting and continuing this dialogue that hopefully will continue beyond this summit. Let's give it a round of applause for these excellent remarks from our panelists. Just a reminder, there are two different panels going on after this across the street in the law school, in the courtroom, and in Eck Hall of Law 1130. There are two different concurrent panel is about international threats to religious liberty, so we'll ask you to exit this room quickly and make your way across the street. Thank you.